Hi, so my name is Nuestro Nyanamoli, and I'll be sharing with you my experience of an NDE that I had that changed my life. And I guess I'll begin with the day that I broke my neck. Um, so I was floating in water. I was in a lake in Saluda, North Carolina. It was a very peaceful summer day, and I was just enjoying the feeling of the water on my body. I was facing skyward, and I could just see really white puffy clouds. I could see the trees on the edge of the lake, and I was feeling a lot of gratitude. And the reason I was feeling this gratitude was because I was once again meditating. And this had been something I had begun 7 years prior to my NDE. And in my previous life, when I was younger, I was an Army Ranger in the Special Forces in the US, and I had left the military, and after that I found meditation. So in a very real way, I learned that by training for war, I found war. I went to Iraq 3 times, and then as I started to meditate, I started finding peace. So I trained for war and I found war. I started training for peace, and I once again was finding peace in this lake. And after a couple moments of just really nice deep meditation floating in the water, I decided to swim over to a dock. And I was at this lake because it was a party with some friends, a gathering. And so I swam over to a wooden dock, and there was a blue water slide that people were going down. And I got in line and I climbed the stairs of this slide. I got to the top. It was kind of an old blue plastic water slide, like something you'd see in a summer camp movie. Not very sturdy. And the person before me went head first, so I waited for him to go. I didn't think anything of it, and then I went down the slide head first. It was very slick. There was water going down. There was a little spigot at the top. And as soon as I came off the end of the slide going very fast, I dove headfirst into the water and I swept my arms back. But I only had enough time to get my hands maybe away from my face, and then I impacted the bottom of the lake. And what I didn't know was that in that area, it was only 2 feet deep. And the person that went before me must have known, but I didn't know. And I impacted the sand and the rocks, and I broke my neck. Um, and I immediately heard a voice within me that said, "Slow down." And I immediately started practicing meditation again because I was feeling the most intense pain I'd ever felt in my whole life. At first, I thought I had been struck by lightning. I wasn't really understanding where the pain was coming from. There was pain radiating from my neck, going through my whole body, and it took me a moment to even understand that I had just struck the bottom of the lake, and I also couldn't breathe. So I stood up out of the water. It was only up to my knees, and I started stumbling forward. And as I was doing this, I started to see these orbs of light floating in the air, like the size of a basketball, maybe. And in that state, because I was so knocked out, I didn't really take much notice of them. But as I reflect on them now, I start to understand that they were entities or beings. And I was very close to death. And I have the sense that when we get close to death, these spirits, these angels, these guardians kind of come close to get ready for the transition out of the current life. So I stumble out of the water, I make it to a bench. Friends realize that something is very wrong. At that point, I don't know my neck is broken, but I know I'm in a lot of pain. They help me to lay down on the bench, and because of my medical military training, I knew I was going into shock. I knew I had to lie down, elevate my feet. And when I was in a position of laying down on this bench, the voice within me again said, "You have to go now." So I told everybody within earshot, I have to go now. And I tried to use my arm to push myself up off the bench and sit up. And that's when I realized that I was half paralyzed on one side of my body, because rather than pushing myself up, I just fell off the bench face first into the gravel. And then there was a commotion around me. I could feel hands around me underneath my armpits lifting me up, moving me to a vehicle. They put me in the car and we rushed to the hospital. It was about a 40-minute drive. And once we arrived at the hospital, um, I was told after they did the scans that I had severely broken my neck. I had crushed the bones in my vertebrae, and if the car had stopped abruptly, there would have been nothing holding my head, and I would have died. Um, so I was told then that I had to go into emergency surgery, but that a team was needed. It was a very complicated surgery, so I'd have to spend the night in the hospital. The surgery would be done the next day, and it sounds incredibly painful. Um, but what I was doing was essentially practicing meditation the same way I'd been taught by teachers and monks in monasteries, which was to just observe the sensations in my body and try not to have any resistance to it, and try not to have any craving for it to go away, just to be fully with the pain. And as I did that, it started to change. It was like a fire burning my body, but I was able to be with it, and I can describe it kind of like riding a wave. So if you're surfing a wave, you're on top of this energy and it's quite blissful. But if you fall into the wave, you get tumbled and it's quite painful. So I reached a point where I was feeling this intense pain in my neck. I was feeling it radiating throughout my body, the part that I could feel. But it wasn't pain. It was just incredible change. And I was offered morphine, and I said I'd rather not take it. I would like to just be with this pain, especially if I'm going to die. I know it's important to be very aware of my final breath. So I was just focusing on my breathing, just focusing on the pain, and laying in this hospital room. And after a couple hours, it was too much. The pain overcame me. I guess I could say I fell off the surfboard and I was now tumbling in my pain. It was just too intense. I couldn't take it anymore. So I said, yes, okay, I'll take morphine. So they administered morphine, and then a strange thing happened. I was laying on the stretcher, and it seemed as though the nurse was dimming the lights very slowly, and um, and I started feeling as though I was being pulled into a tunnel going backwards. And that's when I realized, I'm actually dying. And what happened was I was in such a weakened state that my body couldn't really handle the sudden rush of morphine, and my heart stopped. And I could hear on the monitor behind me my own heart flatline. And then I began to get very scared because I could see nurses running into the room, but I was seeing them from the kind of the end of a tunnel that kept getting longer and longer. But as they rushed into the room, their fear, their emotion of fear combined with mine washed over my physical body and kind of reignited my physical energy, and I felt myself coming back down the tunnel and coming back into my body. And that was the first moment where I really began to leave and really began to have the near death experience, the out of body experience. The next one would come the next day. So in preparation for surgery the following day, I was again laying in the stretcher, and I had a neck brace on. This was 2020 during COVID, so they put a mask on my face, but because of the neck brace, it kept slipping up over my eyes. So I felt very confined. It was as though I was locked in a little box. And all I could do was meditate. It was like the smallest meditation cell or meditation room I've ever been in. And as they pulled the mask back down, I asked the nurses where my body's going to go. And this again felt like the voice that was within me that was talking at the lake. And they said, oh, well, we're going to take you to surgery. And I said, no, for some reason, it's very important that I know exactly where my body goes. So they said, okay, we're going to take you down the hallway, take you to this elevator, take you up to this floor, and take you to this room, and then we'll begin surgery. And then we'll bring you back down, and you'll wake up in the same room. So I said, okay. And the final thing they had me do was sign with my unparalyzed hand a paper that said, I understand that when I wake up, I may be fully paralyzed, and I may not survive. I may die during the surgery. Let me take a sip of water real quick. So they began to administer the medication to put me under, and the next thing I recall, the next thing I remember is being fully out of my body and standing at a doorway. And it was a doorway kind of floating in space, floating in the void. It was darkness all around, but there were stars in the distance. And in front of me, there were 6 beings of light. And they were very tall, maybe 11 feet tall. The doorway was maybe 15 feet tall, or at least that was my perception. But I was fully out of my body. And these beings were incredibly wise. And we had finished some type of long conversation. The surgery was about 6 hours, but I couldn't remember, or I was made not to remember what they showed me and what we discussed, what we talked about. The interesting thing is, after the surgery, I began to remember more. And actually, what you see behind me is something I'll share about in a second, but it's essentially the vision that they kind of gave to me, which I'm now supposed to share with as many people as will care to look at it. So I'm standing at a doorway, I'm speaking to these beings, and there was an agreement. The first part of the agreement was, you won't remember anything that we've discussed, you won't remember consciously anything that you've seen, because if you do remember, it will be so much that you'll never shut up about it, you'll never stop talking about it. And the second part of the agreement was, you have to do the work. And at that time, I didn't know what the work was. But when I returned home from the hospital, I began to learn what my work was to be, what my mission was to be. So I'm standing at the doorway, I'm seeing these beautiful, luminous beings, and they were dark in the middle, but only because there was so much energy, my spiritual perception wasn't at the level to see them. All I could see was the edges of them, which were incredibly luminous. Right at their periphery was a white light, and then it emanated out to a very peaceful blue. And there was one being that was standing forward, and it felt very much like a masculine energy, and he was speaking to me, but he was surrounded by these other 5 beings, some of which felt feminine, some of which felt masculine, and they all felt incredibly wise and loving, and they all felt this energy of preparing me or getting me ready for something, and what that was I didn't know. And then we ended our conversation, our goodbyes. The agreement was conveyed to me, and then my spiritual body was turned away from them, and I began moving back down a tunnel or back down this area of space toward the earth. And very soon I could see my physical body on a stretcher. I felt as though I was running, but I felt like I was rubber, or like I was a pinwheel, or like a spinning fan of rainbow energy. And actually I've sewn it kind of right here, this being right here, which is just a rainbow body, you could say. So I was moving toward my physical body on the stretcher. I was very happy, almost euphoric and peaceful. And then I reunited with my physical body. I immediately opened my eyes, and I immediately started moving my hands and my feet. And I was incredibly happy and grateful, because I realized in that moment, 1, I'm not dead, and 2, I'm not paralyzed. And the nurses kind of told me, okay, settle down. You just came out of surgery, you have to relax. And so I relaxed my body. I spent the next 3 days in the hospital, and then I went home. And I could not move very much. It was quite a painful recovery process. But about a month after I returned home from the hospital, this work, or this mission that these beings had communicated to me, began to come through. And even though I'm not an artist, and I'm former military, I suddenly had the strong desire to sew, to embroider a tiny rose with needle and thread. And I did this on a very small piece of fabric, and it's actually at the very center of this tapestry, kind of in this area. Um, and even though I had never sewn before, as soon as I started passing the needle through the fabric, I felt this great sense of joy, this great sense of peace, and I was really in love with it. I was very happy. The whole time I was sewing, I was smiling. And after I finished the rose, then I did a little dog, then I did a tree and some flowers, a butterfly, and then I began to attach more pieces of fabric, and I continued to sew. And as I did this, I began to see some of the visions that these beings had shared with me, and I also began to remember my previous life as a Buddhist monk, living in Sri Lanka. And it's strange because I recently went and traveled all the way to Sri Lanka to an island in a small lagoon that I remember from my previous life. And the name of my monk self in this previous life was Nyanamoli, which is the name I'm using now. And in my previous life, I was also a former soldier from the UK, from Britain, who served in World War II. And in the middle of war, I read Buddhist texts, which inspired me to become a monk. And similarly, in this lifetime, when I was in Iraq, I read Buddhist texts that also inspired me to meditate and eventually begin the path to becoming a Buddhist monk. So in this lifetime, I returned to Sri Lanka. I went to the same small island called Polgasdua, or Coconut Island in Sinhalese. I took a little rowboat all the way to this island. I walked down a path barefoot. I met with a Buddhist monk. He asked me, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I've been sewing a tapestry. I can remember being a monk in a past life, and I remember being here on this island." And then he said, "Well, I also remember being here in a past life, and I remember being your teacher." And it was this very strange moment of recognizing multiple lifetimes and really understanding that we live a human life, and then we leave the body, and then sometimes we come back into another human life, or sometimes we become a spirit or an angel, or we transition into another form, but the current of energy of the life continues. And also I began to understand it's not the same. So even myself in earlier times when I was a soldier, I'm different than I was then. My energy has changed, and tomorrow I will be different. But as I continued to sew, and this was now in Asheville, North Carolina, still early on after my breaking of the neck, I then felt compelled to travel to Costa Rica, which is actually where I am right now. And I began to connect with the land, and I continued to sew. And as I continued to sew on the beach underneath the palm trees, I began to remember one of the things I saw when I left my body. And other people who have NDEs sometimes speak of going to a hall of records. Sometimes they say it's the Akashic records. And many people are offered the opportunity to look at these grand bookshelves. Sometimes they go on forever, and they're able to pick out a book and look at one of their previous lives. Some people have the experience, and maybe it's because they're more artistically inclined, or maybe because they're not so bookish, they're able to go into a room which is called the tapestry room, and they're able to see this giant, beautiful tapestry that is being woven by itself, and each thread represents a human life, or each thread represents a spirit or an angel. Some of the human lives, you could say, are very unwholesome, or very evil or dark. Some of the lives are very saintly, or very high in vibration. When you look at them individually, maybe one thread is black and very thin and sickly looking, and maybe one thread is very thick and golden like a rope. But when you look at the whole tapestry and you pull back, you begin to see that it's all energy, and it's all woven perfectly, and none of it's wrong. And so I think the message now that I realize I'm I'm continuing to share by sewing, and it's only been recently that I began speaking about it. I've been sewing in silent meditation for almost 4 years now. Um, but the message that continues to come through is that the times we live in, depending on where you look, it can seem very dark. It can seem very violent and confused. It can seem like a lot of people are suffering, and they are. And then in other places, you can see people doing yoga, people meditating, people singing, people gathering in ceremony, people being silent, sharing love with their children, with their friends, with their elders. When you pull back, you can see that we are all part of a grand tapestry. We are all threads that are very interwoven, and each of us is uniquely, utterly important. We all serve a very important purpose, and we're all meshing together and creating something very beautiful. And when we're in the physical body, it's sometimes hard to see that because we have our very limited perspective. But when we have these near-death experiences and we leave the body, we gain a grander perspective. But we don't have to die or come so close to death to have this perspective. We can also sit in silence and experience it in a more peaceful way. And I think the message for the future is not to be afraid, that we are all exactly where we need to be. And we've all chosen to come into this human lifetime. I mean, if you're watching this, you're in a human body and you're having your unique experience, and it's exactly as it needs to be. And the healing that we all know the planet needs right now comes through all of us. And we're all a part of it. Um, and I think the future is hopeful. I think we're going to see more destruction and violence, but we're also going to see a lot of beauty and a lot of healing and a lot of coming together. I also think we're going to see a lot of people turning their phones off and just gathering in person to just share our collective energy. And I think that there is also now and in the future going to be a reawakening of some abilities that we forgot we have, especially the ability to heal each other, to heal ourselves and heal each other. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do now and going into the future is to be with nature, to be in the forest, to be in the oceans, to be in the rivers and the lakes, and to really connect with the peacefulness of nature. Because as the world changes, nature is changing at the exact right speed. The vibration of the trees is changing, the vibration of the water is changing. And so as we reconnect with the wilderness, with the wild world, it helps to reground ourselves so we don't get too caught into the swirl of all of the ugliness that we see on the planet. And one other thing that often comes to mind, which I think can be helpful to share, is that we can imagine the world as a body, and we can imagine cities that are in war or destruction. We can imagine those as scabs or sores or wounds on the planet. But we can imagine nature as the healing skin that's regrowing over the entire planet. And so if we only stare at the wounds, we're going to think that the entire world is sick. But if we turn away from the wounds and we refocus our gaze on nature, on trees, if we refocus on planting our own small gardens, we're beginning to regrow the skin and regrow the body of the earth. And I think ultimately what I'm trying to sow and what I'm trying to convey is the image of a peaceful garden. Because I think, it's funny, there's a little lizard. I think that the earth, a nice way to look at it is a giant garden, and we all live in the garden, and we can all do our part to make it beautiful where we are, where we live. We can always grow some type of flower or plant, and that spreads peace to anybody else who sees it. And we can also take the garden and turn it into concrete and roads and metal and factories, and that's not so pretty. And people that see it feel a little bit uneasy. We can fill it with cell phone towers and a lot of jittery vibration that causes a lot of anxiety. And that's maybe not the best use of the garden. So I think as I sow, the message that I'll continue to sow my whole life is just a beautiful, peaceful garden, which I think as more of us can see the world in that way, we can more quickly bring about the healing that the planet needs, and also realize that the planet, the earth, the universe, the galaxies, there's an order to all of this. So sickness comes, but then it goes, and the earth re-heals itself. And as we tune in, as we meditate, as we become peaceful, we will know exactly what we can do as our part to heal ourselves, to heal our family relationships and our friends, and to heal our small section of the garden and share that beauty, share that peace. So my message for the future, it's very hopeful. I think that we're coming through maybe some dark times, but you can think of it like an addict who is very addicted to drugs, but suddenly hits rock bottom and then has an awakening and becomes very healthy and clean and then inspires other people. I think that the planet itself is doing that right now. I think the planet itself is healing, and that it's inspiring us, and that as we heal, we will inspire others. Yes, so these 6 beings that I met, your question is, do I feel them now? Do I see them now? And did they have some message for the future?
Yeah.
It's interesting because as I'm reflecting on that question, I'm getting some subtle chills and like a good feeling. So I always feel that they're around, and especially when I'm speaking with somebody, a friend or a family member, and the energy is good, sometimes I will see them appear. And for me, they appear as a very small light, like a diamond sized light that is hovering in the air. And often it's hovering near the head of the person I'm speaking with. And then sometimes I see them when I'm sewing alone. I will see a flash of light, and I know that they're close by. And because they don't have physical form, and we're very much in the three-dimensional reality, or that's where our perception is focused, they appear simply as light, as a concentrated point of energy just for a moment. And I feel a strong reminder that they're around, and it's very nice. The message for the future, I mean, as I tune into them now, it's the first message is that it's not the end. We're not at the end of the world. We're at a very pivotal moment of incredible change, and that the beauty that is on the horizon, the change that is to come, is almost beyond what we can imagine, and for good reason. And that we can align ourselves with this beauty that is coming by remaining peaceful, and that the most important thing to do is to take time out of our day just to sit down with our legs folded in a peaceful position with our eyes closed and just be aware, and to be aware without resisting anything that is, and without craving or desiring for the moment to be anything other than as it is. But yeah, the message for the future is very much that it is, not only is it hopeful, but this is a natural course of events. And that we all have the strength, we all have the spiritual power, and the love and the connection to source that we all individually need to make it through, to survive, to continue on. And that we're all here for a reason. And also we live in a time, I mean, and this gives me a lot of chills, but look how we are connecting. I mean, I'm some random guy living in Costa Rica, and I'm just sowing. And in the past, we were only able to see news footage from very serious media organizations, and the stories were very cultivated and very specific to making money or selling us some specific version of world events. But now, as more and more of us awaken, as more and more of us realize that our main reason for existing in human form is to love and to spread love and to be peaceful, as we share these messages, we reignite that strong, good spiritual energy, and the connections happen very fast. The serendipity increases very quickly. It doesn't take lifetimes of meditation. It takes one moment of sitting in silence. So the message for the future from these beings of light I met is that things will continue to I want to say like move upward. They will continue to improve spiritually, and that we're here to learn lessons and to grow.